Anxiety feels like hopelessness. It feels like overwhelming fear. It feels like nothing in the world is right and nothing will ever be right. It feels like death. It feels just like it feels overwhelming and scary and confining, suffocating. It's dark and it's depressing and it's heavy. I started having anxiety about 6 years ago. I was taking a night class at Columbus State. Everything was normal. Class was as it normally was and everything. I just didn't feel right. So I sat down and the teacher started talking just like normal, like everything was happening as it normally does, but something inside of me felt very not normal. I remember sitting there and like my hands started to shake and my heart starts like racing and I'm like sweating and I can't control it, and I just had like this feeling that I was going to die that night. Like, I don't know why, or I didn't know how I was going to die or whatever, but that's what I felt like. I was dating Luke at the time, and he was up in Polaris with a friend having dinner, and I just remember texting him, telling him that when this class took a break that I was gonna leave because I couldn't handle what was going on anymore and couldn't really explain what was happening to him either. And so he met me in the parking lot that night. He got from Polaris to Grove City about as fast as anyone has ever gotten there, but he met me in the parking lot and I just started crying.
You know, when I got to the school and picked up Allie, I had no idea what to do. I had no idea what to say. I just got there and she came up to me and she just started crying and she was shaking, and I had no idea what was going on inside of her. I had no idea. I just know it was an extremely scary night, and it was the beginning of the horribleness of what anxiety is.
And I just remember getting to my car and just sobbing because I didn't know what was going on. I had never heard of anxiety or panic attacks. Like, all I knew was that something inside of me was going on. I didn't know how to control it. I ended up texting my mom and telling her, you know, how I was feeling. And she was the one that like first said, I think that you're dealing with anxiety. And that had been the first time that I had ever heard that word being used, ever. So that night we went over to Luke's parents' house right after class and talking to his parents about what was going on as well. And Denise, my mother-in-law, she then told Pastor Travis what was going on, so then he could come up to me later that Sunday and ask me to grab coffee with him so we could talk about what I was dealing with. I was always a nervous kid growing up. I would always go to the doctor because I had stomach issues. I was always nervous. No one really told me that I was dealing with anxiety, but I was, and I just didn't know it yet. Later that week, me and Pastor Travis met at Starbucks, and I sat and told him everything. He listened, and he told me everything that I needed to hear, that although my thoughts weren't real, they felt very real. And he walked me through practical steps of how to fight this going further. His first step was to be putting on the spiritual armor every single day. Ephesians 6 talks about the whole armor of God and the different pieces, and he walked me through those and taught me how to pray them over my life. And literally every day since then, I have prayed that spiritual armor over myself every single day, and it has drastically changed my life. One of the steps in spiritual armor is the sword of the Spirit, and it's the spoken word. And so he taught me how to pick out verses that made me feel at peace when I read them. In moments of like anxiousness or fear or worry, I'd say these scriptures out loud, which feels dumb, but there's so much power in like the spoken word of God. The third step was to start visualizing my thoughts as pieces of paper. And this just kind of was to get in the mindset of being aware of every thought that went into my brain. And visualizing as pieces of paper when they entered, like seeing it, recognizing if it's from God or it's from the enemy. And if it's not from God, you just crumple it up and throw it away. And if it is from God, to file it away. And those are the thoughts that you store in your brain and keep for later. This is my craft room where I keep everything that I need to run my business, which is the Ville Crochet. Shortly after I started dealing with anxiety, I picked up crocheting. It's one of the hardest parts about anxiety is your brain can't focus on anything. And I found that crocheting helps my mind focus. And so I picked it up. It steadies me in times of anxiety and gives me something for my hands to do when they're feeling nervous. And I have turned it into a whole business. So those steps that Pastor Travis gave me were a great starting point. And I practiced those, and I learned a lot from doing those things. Every time that like anxiety would start to come into my brain or whatever, but it's not going to stop anxious thoughts from coming into your mind. Nothing is going to stop anxious thoughts from coming into your mind. I think that once anxiety kind of enters your brain, it doesn't leave completely. I think you learn to deal with it. And I've learned like so many things in the 5 years that I've been living with anxiety. Like people have given me different tips and tricks and all this stuff, and I've tried them all and I do them all and they're great and they're helpful. But the only way to fully beat anxiety is to trust that God knows best and that He has this in His hands. For me personally, anxiety comes from a misplaced trust in other things. When I'm afraid that a situation is going to happen to me, it's because I'm trusting that this is going to happen instead of trusting that God has me in His hands and He cares for me deeply. I lose sight of that, and that's when panic attacks happen, that's when anxiety happens, that's when fear takes place and takes over your brain. So literally the only way that I have found that fights anxiety is to trust 100% in Jesus Christ. Anxiety is dark, but Jesus is light. Anxiety is hopeless, but Jesus is hope. Anxiety is scary, and Jesus is fearless. Anxiety is from our enemy, but Jesus has already defeated him.